In this lesson, we're going to take a look at one of the pivotal battles of the War of Independence, and that was the battle known as Saratoga. Saratoga, we really like to look at its backstory first, and for that, we're going to take a look at the character of General Burgoyne, who was a British leader. General Burgoyne was largely stationed up in Canada and in places like northern New York, and his job was to move his way south, gradually taking over and subduing all of those northern colonies and various towns and so forth. Well, Burgoyne had one primary weakness. It's what we call vanity. He was very proud of himself and especially liked the speeches that he gave to his men, which he called rally speeches because they were supposed to inspire his men to greatness. And he thought that they were so finely crafted that he used to have them written down and then sent to the newspapers back in London so that all of the English-speaking world could also read his wonderful words. Well, the battle, or the story of Saratoga, really begins in August of 1777. It was during that time that Burgoyne sent troops to capture some supplies of weapons and gunpowder and food supplies and so forth that were supplies given to the Continental Army. One of the incredible things about this storage of supplies was that all these supplies had not been purchased by Congress. They'd not been purchased by the Army. They'd not been purchased by any of the states. They had actually been donated largely by farmers from New Hampshire. And the place he was trying to find them at was a place called Bennington, Vermont. But that whole notion that common farmers would give up the things that they worked hard for, or would give up their silver to buy these things in the first place, shows you the whole spirit of volunteering, which is evident throughout all of the war. It's very common for people to take their pewter dishes and donate them to the army so they could be melted down and turned into bullets. That kind of thing happened frequently. Well, he tried to take over these supplies, but the militias from places like New Hampshire and places like Massachusetts, as well as those Green Mountain Boys from Vermont, they stopped him. He was not actually able to get through. But that's just one part of the backstory. Another part of the backstory was Washington's army. And the Continental Army, even though Washington was a supreme commander, the Continental Army was often divided, trying to protect different regions during this time. And Washington, down in Pennsylvania, roughly in the middle of the colonies, had just suffered a huge defeat at a place called Brandywine River. And part of the reason he'd suffered this defeat was because he had given orders to his scouts to look at certain roadways and to watch certain passages and then quickly notify him if the British made any moves. The problem was, these orders were not obeyed. It's one of the few times you see Washington's orders not carried out to the letter T the way that he actually ordered them. So as a result, he had just suffered a huge defeat. Meanwhile, General Howe was down in New York, in the southern part of around the city, with some 27,000 British troops, and his brother, the Admiral Howe, was out off the coast with a huge flotilla of British warships. And so the Americans really didn't have anything to praise at this point. Even though Trenton and Princeton had happened the previous year, they seemed as if they had happened decades ago, because after all, a lot of bad things had occurred since then. So at Saratoga, or what will become the Battle of Saratoga, was a very pivotal fight. What Burgoyne was after when he went down south to try and attack the United States forces, or the American forces, was he was after securing his supply lines from Canada further south to New York. And the idea was he would eventually link up with all of those soldiers of Howe's down in the New York City area. Now, the Continental Army was led by a general by the name of Horatio Gates. And Horatio Gates, even though he had some experience in the military and so forth, was not exactly the greatest of leaders. In fact, Gates, from what we can tell, probably gained his position of being in charge of this force because his wife was very good at making friends. And so Gates really was not a very capable leader. What's interesting, though, is the very first action between the British and the American forces. This happened on September 19th of the year 1777. It was on that day, early in the morning, before dawn actually occurred, that a group of about 20 Continental soldiers decided that they would go, along with an old trumpet, and they would find where the British picket lines were. They successfully found a British camp. The 20 of them surrounded what was several more, possibly dozens, maybe even roughly 100 British soldiers. They were surrounding them in such a degree that when they all shouted and blew the trumpet at the same time, the British soldiers thought they were surrounded by a much larger army, and they ended up surrendering to this smaller force of 20. It's kind of a moment like Gideon in the book of Judges. Well, this led to an all-out battle on September 19th, and it was during this battle that people like Daniel Morgan, who were actually assigned to Gates' army, his sharpshooters were able to successfully pick off several of the British officers. It was one of the things that drew the British crazy. They hated the fact that the Americans targeted officers and didn't fight what they called a polite war. In fact, there have been funny videos made about the polite war, but it wasn't a polite war. The American colonists saw themselves as fighting for their lives, and it was war. So it's not as if you're not going to actually shoot at the enemy, and particularly shoot at his commanding officers so that you can have the advantage. That battle, however, essentially went to a draw. Both sides dug in, and they would not meet again until October the 7th of the year 1777. It was on this day that the Battle of Saratoga really cements itself in our history. What happened at the very beginning of that day, you can look back at the British headquarters. And at the British headquarters, which was this beautiful house that had been taken over by the British, several of the wives of the generals, who always came along with the army because they just assumed there would always be victory for their husbands, were planning a great dinner party for that evening. And had you gone into the house of this headquarters on that day of October 7th, you would have seen a magnificent dinner party arranged, and a magnificent array of flowers and tablecloths and fine china and fine silverware and so forth. Because after all, they were expecting the conflict to be over quickly and time for their husbands to be home for this wonderful dinner party. Meanwhile, a colonel by the name of Colonel Fraser, who was a member of the British Army, himself was a Scotsman, was sent by Burgoyne to outflank, to outmaneuver, get around to the side of the American forces. He was actually a very gutsy commander. He was known for his bravery. He was known for his nobility and chivalry also. However, Daniel Morgan, seeing him come, realized that the best way to stop him was for his sharpshooters to take him out. They did so. Fraser did not die on the battlefield. Instead, as the battle was beginning to become much more difficult for the British than they anticipated, Fraser was carried back still alive to that headquarters, and needing a place to quickly lay him so the surgeon could come and operate on him, they chose that table laid out for the dinner party, and they put him there, amidst the fine china and the flowers. It was while he was dying that he cried out, "Oh, fatal ambition." It was probably his judgment upon the entire war, that he saw this war as unnecessary, and he saw it as a violation of the colonists' rights in the first place. He died in this conflict on that day. In fact, later on, when the funeral would occur to actually bury him, Morgan's men, who were nearby, famously saluted the casket as it passed, because Morgan and his men saw in Fraser a great warrior, someone whose talents had really been wasted in this unjust war on the side of the British. Meanwhile, Gates was indecisive. He really wasn't sure what he should be doing or how to actually fight this battle. So it's around this time that a younger man, also a general at this time, a man by the name of Benedict Arnold, another famous character in American history, begins to give orders to the men, begins to rally the American Continentals to keep charging by shouting, "Come on, boys, go get them, boys," and so forth. In fact, Arnold, who had no direct command over a lot of these guys, took a position that he didn't actually have permission to do. But because Arnold did it, it probably saved the day. In fact, the only thing that slowed him down was a bullet through the leg. But rather than be taken back to the hospital, he simply had his aides lay him down next to a tree where he had some shade. He had them bind up the wound, and he continued to shout orders from his fallen position. It was this kind of action that actually won the day. As a result, the British began to retreat. They began to realize that they could not win this battle, so they began to flee, and Arnold gave orders to the Americans to actually pursue the British in flight. As a result, probably more British soldiers fell while they were retreating than when they were attacking. There's a simple reason for that. When you're retreating, your back is to the enemy. And as a result, you can't easily see what the enemy is doing, nor can you easily defend yourself. Burgoyne and all of his officers then had a council of war in Burgoyne's tent. His officers said, "We do not have this day won. Not only that, but we need to surrender. Otherwise, we will be completely defeated." After all, the Americans were still pursuing them. Burgoyne said, "No, I will not surrender to these rebels." It was at this moment that, humorously, a cannonball went right through his tent, an American cannonball. And so he said, "Actually, surrender sounds like a great idea right now." And so Burgoyne, along with nearly 6,000 British soldiers, surrendered to Horatio Gates, who, and as he said to Horatio Gates, he said, "I surrender to you because the fortunes of war have defeated me." Gates actually commended him and refused to take his sword, saying that he should keep it because he had fought honorably. Now, this battle not only gave huge courage to the young American nation, but it also brought allies. In fact, seeing the results of this battle, both France and Spain would join the American colonies in their fight against Britain. That was a key strategy that was needed in order to successfully win this war, and especially to win independence.